Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sensory Friendly Saturdays. My name is Emma, and I'm a host at the Ontario Science Centre. I'm so excited to be joined today not only by all of you who made the time to tune in, but also our guests, Cassie Steep and Sherron Grant. If you would like live subtitles for today's event, please look for the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that while we are all joining from different locations, we're all meeting here today on Turtle Island, which has been inhabited and cared for by Indigenous people since time immemorial. The Ontario Science Centre and myself are both located in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It has been their home for thousands of years and continues to be the home of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This land is covered by the Treaties 13 and 13A with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We encourage everyone who's watching today to learn about the peoples, treaties, and histories of the land we live on. One helpful resource is the site whos.land. Now, I would also like to give a special welcome to anyone who's joining Sensory Friendly Saturday for the first time, or who might be new to the Zoom format. We run these events on the first Saturday of every month, and we discuss a wide range of topics, from new research and community support to specific tips and strategies for everyday situations, like building independence and creating routines. Let us know if there's something that you'd like to see next. All of our past Zoom sessions are recorded and are available on the Ontario Science Centre website. Now that means that this session is also being recorded, so don't worry if you have to step away or if you're worried you might miss something. The chat has been disabled, but the Q&A feature of the Zoom is open. We would love to hear from you during the presentation, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature. You don't have to ask a specific question, but this option gives you the option to ask anonymously if you'd like, and it also helps us keep track of the conversation. We'll be using the chat to provide links to various resources, and we'll also be sending a follow-up email when this is finished with all the resources in the chat. We'll also have linked in that email, a survey for you to fill out at the end. Your feedback is very important to us, so it's very helpful if you can fill out that survey. I'll be moderating the questions and the comments during the discussion, and there'll be time for us to answer them at the end. We'll also be using polls to ask you guys questions. I would love to try one out now. In just a moment, one will pop up on your screen, and it's asking you about yourself. You can input your response and you can select as many as you'd like. It's asking, are you an educator? Are you someone with autism spectrum disorder? Are you a parent? It just helps us figure out who's attending these meetings. Take a moment to submit your answers. Oh, great. Oh, it looks like we've got a really good mix joining us today. We've got some parents, we've got some people with autism spectrum disorder, we've got some educators. Wonderful. Now, we'd also like to know, to get a little more information about yourselves, to know how experienced you are with autism spectrum disorder and what kind of prior knowledge you're bringing into this. So another poll will pop up right now with that question. And you don't have to think about it too much. It's just to help us explain things best. And if there's ever anything that we're talking about that you don't understand or you'd like us to go into more detail, feel free to just pop it in the Q&A and we'll explain everything. Take a moment to answer that one. And we'll be submitting the poll in just a couple seconds. Oh, perfect. Okay. Oh, this looks good. Once again, we've got a good mix. Most people have at least some information about autism spectrum disorder, and quite a few people are quite knowledgeable. Wonderful. Okay, now that we've learned a little more about you, let's hear a little more about our guests and give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. Cassie, would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you so much, Emma. Hi, everybody. I'm Cassie Steep. I'm a training and development specialist from Sonderly. So that's the training division of the Geneva Centre for Autism. And the Geneva Centre for Autism, for those who do not know, they have a wide range of age-specific programs tailored towards individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So I believe that our website will be posted in the chat shortly, but for more information on Geneva Centre specifically, you can email info@autism.net. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Sonderly during my presentation. Just wanted to share that for about 7 years, I was in the intensive behavioral intervention program as an instructor therapist. So I have experience working with students with autism. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Cassie. I can't wait to hear more about your work. Sherron, would you like to tell us more about yourself?
Of course. Thanks, Emma. And again, good morning and a welcome to all of the attendees who are joining us this morning. My name is Sherron Grant, and I come at this with a few hats. Firstly, I'm a parent of a young adult on the autism spectrum. So I've been on this journey, on this path for just over 20 years. I'm also an educator. I'm a principal with the Toronto District School Board. And finally, I recently, in partnership with my husband, we co-founded a Black parent support group for families with children and adults with various disabilities. And we're a support group that meets twice a month just to provide connection and support to one another. So several hats that I bring this morning to what I'll be sharing with you later. And again, I'll share a little bit more about myself later as well, like Cassie in my presentation.
That's wonderful. Thank you both so much. I'm so glad you guys could join us today. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Cassie to start.
Thank you so much. So my presentation is geared towards educators, but that doesn't mean that for the parents, caregivers, or anyone else in the audience that you won't get something from this presentation. I hope it doesn't mean that. But the strategies that I'll share today will be useful across environments. Today, I'd like to discuss back to school transition tips for students with autism spectrum disorder. So back to what Sonderly is specifically, as I mentioned, we are the training division of the Geneva Centre for Autism. And here's our website and links to our social medias. We are an educational and training platform that decodes clinical research and shares them in a user-friendly way. So we do that, we build courses, offer speaker presentations, and we do live custom training. So if you are an educator or a parent or caregiver or an individual with autism, there will be something for you on our platform. So, we're all back to school. I imagine it was a daunting, challenging, exciting time for everybody involved. And let's not forget, it's been the pandemic, right? So lots of new faces, new places, and routines to be had. So my first question to the audience here today is, have you experienced it, whether it be yourself, anyone who's struggled with transitions in September? Because I know I have. So I'm just waiting to see all the responses pour in. This is wonderful. We've got 100% of you saying, yes, you have some experience with somebody. It might be a student, child, friend, or yourself who's struggled with transitions in September, because this is a fresh start, and we have to establish new routines, and it can be challenging for some. And it could be especially challenging for individuals with autism, right? The insistence on sameness, potentially it cause anxiety within them. So I'm glad to see that, we're all here today to learn a little bit about how to ease that transition. And I have a few tips for you. I won't be speaking too long, and there's always more to say on this subject. So I tried to narrow down to the most pressing things that I believe in this climate would be helpful. So broadly, we've all started school potentially already, but it doesn't mean that we can't be sending home resources, right? So we can send home as many visuals as we can, information to the student and their caregivers of the classroom potentially. They might be entering a new classroom. So any posted visuals you have, let's say there are rules or expectations, it might be especially useful with COVID-19 here and all of those new protocols and visuals and expectations and rules that we have. Those things being sent home might be beneficial. You can ask the caregiver to go over those rules when applicable, and therefore that consistency among the environments would be beneficial for the student. It could be pictures of yourself or any other staff members that student will come across in the day. But also broadly, we want to ask as many questions as possible to ease the transition. Getting to know the student is so important, so we can collect information such as their preferences, dislikes, so that we're not offering things that it's just an absolute no way for them. That's beneficial, having known a little bit more about their strengths and deficits before they walk into the classroom and their preferred communication method. So you can imagine that the students have been off on this wonderful summer holiday, right? Potentially free access to individual preferences, maybe unlimited access to things that they like, activities that they like doing. Maybe they get to sleep in, maybe they don't have to share, who knows? But you can imagine having been at home, when you walk into the classroom, it's a big adjustment, right? It's a big adjustment, and it could end up being that no fun zone. So we want to recreate that summer holiday vibe for them in the beginning to make it feel like a welcoming environment, right? The goal is to have successful transitions so that the student will spring out of bed in the morning and can't wait to enter your classroom. So what will that look like? How can we ensure that that happens? This is something that isn't necessarily, I don't believe it gets enough attention as it deserves. So we talk about pairing, and essentially that just means relationship building. So I think having the students being at home over the summer and even that extended time during the lockdowns, we really need to focus on this piece before we dive into those academic demands. Right? We need to get that student buy-in before we start asking too much of them, because we're competing with that summer holiday break and those extended lockdowns. So what is pairing? Essentially, it looks like the educator freely giving access to reinforcement and engaging with that student in a really exciting and fun way before presenting academic demands, developing trust with that student buy-in. So it looks like doing more observing and listening. You're going to watch the student in the classroom and observe, listen, what are they saying? How do you get to know them on a deeper level? Be playful and animated, comment, but avoid asking too many questions, right? You're following the student's lead, try to limit instructions and demands at first. Remember, creating that welcoming environment. And when it comes to language, less is more. I would imagine some students potentially coming from a really quiet home environment into the hustle and bustle of a new classroom. And we don't want talking heads. It could be quite daunting for that student. So less is more when it comes to language at first and when we're relationship building. So I have a question for the audience. I like to ask educators when I do training. Would you be more likely to do favors for the colleague who brings you a coffee, or if you're not a coffee fan, a tea or a snack every morning? Would you be more likely to do a favor for that coworker? So the question is yes. Oh, okay. So I'm just getting notification that the host screen is unfortunately frozen. So the question was, would you be more likely to do a favor for a colleague who brings you a coffee, tea? I mean, I know I would. I ask this question a lot. I see yes across the board. We'll see if I can just move on. And I apologize for everybody that we can't answer that question. But also to say this particular question is to highlight that freebies are important in the beginning in that relationship. So provide, fewer expectations, because we want the student to know that when they're around you, really good things happen, and that's going to create that welcoming environment to make that transition really smooth for that student. I'm going to move on. So on top of that free access to preferred, we know that you're eager to bridge that what do they call it? The learning gap that potentially might have happened through the pandemic or even from the summer break, right? You're going to try to fill those missing holes and do your job and get to teaching. But we want to remind you that, once again, to establish that fun environment, that reinforcement is going to be key. And we talk to educators a lot about the value of reinforcement, but there is a right way and a wrong way of doing it. So that's why this quote I love, it's properly used as highlighted. Properly used positive reinforcement is extremely powerful. So I'll get to talking about a few ways to increase the value of reinforcement for the students. So as we mentioned, reinforcement is key. If you're confident that you've done that pairing process and that you want to slowly begin to use these rewards to build those new skills. So you would know that that pairing process is potentially, complete, but there's no start and end to it. You can always go back to that pairing process. If you notice signs that potentially that student, they don't want to approach you, they don't want to raise their hand, you can watch for facial expressions, potentially just in general compliance. There's no end to that pairing process, but when you are going to teach skills, try to use reinforcement. It will help build those skills quickly. So you'll want to identify highly preferred items and activities. So those are going to be individualized, because we know that preferences change and it's best not to make assumptions, right? So we also know that some students with autism, they might be nonverbal and have a receptive language deficit. So you can't necessarily ask the student and get that response that you're looking for. And to really know that preferences do change and to really understand it's best not to make assumptions is going to be key, so that you're not providing reinforcement that student isn't necessarily keen on. And when you do find that reinforcer, one of the key things to delivering reinforcement is to deliver as immediate as possible. So we like to say, if possible, deliver that reinforcer to the student about 2 to 5 seconds following the behavior you wish to see more of. So my question to the audience now is, after a long day, what do you reward yourself with? So it could be, sorry, I'm just going to check my messages here. Okay, so we still do not have access to the polls, unfortunately. So I'd like to just describe here what I was going for. So you can think in your own mind, what do you like to do after a long day? Do you like to go on a walk? Do you like to have a bath? Do you save yourself for a big chocolate? Do you have a glass of wine? And I couldn't possibly answer that question for you, right? I need you to tell me what you would like to reward yourself with. So that's essentially what I'm getting at here when it comes to deciding what's reinforcing. It's best not to decide for somebody else, because even if you say to me that you love chocolate at the end of the day, you might get bored of having chocolate every single day. So those preferences will change. And for the students who cannot answer those questions directly, we can provide them with a preference assessment. This particular preference assessment will be posted in the chat, and you can feel free to download it. There's lots of different preference assessments that one could use, but we chose this one to highlight, and the instructions are on it for you of how to run it, because it is quick and easy. And parents in the audience, you could also use it with your child at home. It's easy to run, and it gives you a hierarchy of preferences, and you can do it multiple times if needed, right? Because preferences change. And once you found that reinforcer for your student, you can build skills that are so necessary to teach quickly, and the student will be motivated and happy to come back to your classroom. So this section is what I consider sort of the meat and potatoes of this presentation, given that it's specific strategies for when transitions become tough, right? So as I mentioned, or I don't know if I mentioned, I'm sorry, transitions in general are difficult for some students with autism, and transitions can either be big or small, right? Transitioning from one area of the classroom to another, or down the hall from one class to another class location, or it could even be from middle school to high school. These are specific strategies that I have used, all of these, sometimes all at once, sometimes I pick and choose based on the student. But the first strategy is a visual schedule. I use visual schedules, I use my planner. Having that sort of plan for the day and that acknowledgement of what's going to happen next is so beneficial to everyone, but especially as I've seen students with autism, right? And it might be the case that you want to individualize that visual schedule as opposed to using a classroom-wide visual schedule. You might want to include more for certain students. Just be aware if they're attending to those visual schedules and have them have ownership over their day in that sense. Another recommendation is to provide that student ample warning that that transition is going to occur. And you're going to want to do that in a concrete way, potentially provide visuals to that student about that warning. And what I mean by concrete, I mean when you say it's time to tidy up, be more specific. You can say stack 3 more blocks and then tidy up. But also you could use a timer, and timers are great for students who do struggle understanding receptive language, because they are a concrete visual representation of time being all done and it's time to move on. What I mean here by regulation aids are simply any visual that might remind the student when the transition becomes tough to calm down. So one of those that I like to use is the smell the flower symbol, blow out the candle. So smell the flower, blow out the candle. A picture of a flower and a candle. And it reminds that student to take deep breaths when things go wrong. It could be a nice visual to calm them down, but I suggest to practice that visual before that tough transition as well. First then boards, there is a example here, first then, you might see just first then or first then next. These are wonderful because the educator just needs to provide that verbal instruction one time, but the board says the rest, right? It reminds the student what they need to do and reminds them what they get if they complete that transition successfully. This particular visual and many, many more are found on the visual gallery on Geneva Centre's website. So I invite you to look at that gallery. It has this plus more for you to download. And my very last question to the audience is, have you heard of a transition object before? So I'm noticing that this poll is up and working, which is wonderful. So the question is, have you heard of a transition object? Okay, so 25% of the audience has heard of them, and 75% have not. So a transition object is simply, sometimes the student's anxiety is eased by simply holding on to something during that transition. It might be considered a distractor. It might be that holding that object has purpose. So for example, if you say to the student, it's time to go to the gym, you might want to offer them a ball and say, when you get to the gym, put it in this bin, right? There's a reason that they're transitioning, and it helps ease transitions for some students. It could also be a picture of the location that you're going to. So if you said to the student, you know, it's time to go to the cafeteria, you can give them that picture, and subsequently they can match it to the door when they get there. But transition objects could also be very neutral items that are known to calm that student. So that's what we mean by transition object. Okay, and my very last suggestion is when we talk about, you know, creating that welcoming environment that a student wants to come to every day, we need to consider including peers. in building trust within peers around them. So hosting an autism awareness day so that other students in the classroom can learn or ask questions about autism is beneficial. Positive peer models and mentors can be beneficial for students with ASD. So you can identify preferred peers. You can, for those students who need it, provide a choice board of the peers and ask them, who do you want to connect with today? But I always like to recommend that you need to consult and discuss this plan with the individual with autism themselves and their caregivers for their input, and most importantly, for their consent to do so. But there's lots of resources to host this day, and it is recommended to ease that transition this year. So thank you so much for your time. I know this was a short 15-minute presentation, and you probably have a lot more questions, and there's a lot more information out there. If you did like this presentation and want to know a little bit more, I have suggested these 3 courses here. You can take a look at Sonderly.io for deeper information on the subject. But I look forward to the question and answer period with you all. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you, Cassie. That was wonderful. I know for me, at least, that definitely sparked some questions. I can't wait also for the question period. Sherron, would you like to share with us your presentation?
Thanks so much, Emma. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, and just let me know if there's any difficulty in seeing this. So again, Cassie, yeah, that was a great presentation, especially for myself as an educator myself. I learned a lot as well that I'm going to be taking to school next week to share with my colleagues. So I'm going to be coming at this from a different angle, and I'm more so going to be directed at the parents and caregivers in the audience. But I think a lot of what I'll share will complement what Cassie shared. So all of you educators and caregivers alike will get a full package, I believe, this morning. So parent advocacy, believe it or not, yes, you've got this. So who am I? So here's the love of my life, Isaiah. So as I shared earlier, I'm a parent of a young adult on the autism spectrum. He was diagnosed at about the age of 4, and he turns 25 this year. So it's about 21 years that our family has been on this journey. Because of my son and the inspiration that he is to me and to our entire family, actually, I went back to school, so second career, and became a teacher, and was further inspired and suggested by some of my colleagues to go forward. And now I'm an elementary school principal again here in the city of Toronto. Again, as further inspiration of our son, we decided to create a Black parent support group, again, because oftentimes attending different support groups hosted by different agencies, I didn't see a lot, if any, parents that looked like me and had the same lived experience as me. And it was something that I thought about for years and kept looking for and seeking, but it just didn't happen. So November 2020, we founded our group, and it's been going fantastic ever since. I also consider myself to be an advocate, and over the years, I've sat on different advisory committees and boards of directors of special needs agencies, advocating, again, not just, of course, for my own child, but for many other children and families who need that voice, who oftentimes their voices are not heard and they're not brought to the table. And finally, I consider myself a world traveler. Hopefully, once this pandemic calms down, I can get to seeing some more parts of the world, often on a limited budget. But you know what? Sometimes that's the funnest way to travel. At least for us, it is. I love to eat. I'm a foodie, and I'll try anything just about at least once. And I'm also a grandmother. I'm blessed with a grandson of 3 years old and a granddaughter who's almost 6 months. So I guess we've got the $1 million family, as they say, even though I'm still looking for the $1 million. So planning for a successful school year with a cultural lens. Much of what I'm going to share really is applicable to any family, but I want to add a twist. And if there's any questions later with regards to that cultural lens, with regards to supporting families and raising a child on the spectrum, please add that to the Q&A. But there is a different level of understanding, a different level of work and focus for families that needs to be brought on when you're dealing with the school system and with agencies for coming at from a cultural lens, and specifically as a Black woman. And so the first point I want to discuss is the importance of relationships. Meeting with staff who are working with your child early in the school year. So not waiting for parent-teacher student interview time in November, but if you haven't met with them already, try to meet with them this week. Develop a communication system with them. So I'm speaking here about the classroom teacher, the educational assistant, the special needs assistant, the early childhood educator, the office administrators, the office staff, the lunchroom supervisors, anyone and everyone that comes into contact with your child. For those of us of the African diaspora, there's unfortunately a stereotype and deficit thinking, not only where our children are concerned, but also about us as parents, and that in our parent community, we don't care about our children. And that's why we don't attend meetings. We know that this is not true. And we know there are different ways to demonstrate our care and our involvement. So I do encourage you as caregivers to find your way to express yourself and keep the lines of communication open with the school staff. Understanding that you may be working different jobs and different shifts. You may be in a single parent situation and have, several children to care for. So there's going to be a different way that you have to find to balance your time. But just try to keep those lines of communication open so that they understand what you do and how you do it in order to support your child. Number 2, get involved. Attending those school support team meetings. If you can, try and sit on your school advisory council. Attend a SEAC meeting, Special Education Advisory Council. I was a member of that for 1 year before I became a member, an employee of the board. But there's so much learning that can take place. And again, it's also about bringing our voice to the table. Parent-teacher student conferences, and I say that specifically. Traditionally, it's often the parent comes to the conference and meets with the teacher and leaves the child at home. There's a wonderful Indigenous saying that discusses and says, not about us, without us. I think it's important for the child, whether they're verbal or not, and whether they're able to really participate in the traditional way in the meeting. I think it's really important for your child of any age to attend these meetings and be involved, because again, you're talking about your child and their future. So if at all possible, bring your child to these meetings with you. Try and get involved in fun events at the school as well. Literacy and numeracy events, wellness events, school field trips, and so on, if able. And again, I was a working parent. I was a stay-at-home mom around the time when our child was first diagnosed. So for the first few years, I was home, getting them connected to resources in the community. But then I did go back to school. And so, I've always been a working parent. It's not an easy thing to do, but when you can, try and fit that in. These are significant events that talk about and support the progress of our children. When you attend these meetings, and I know Cassie mentioned this earlier as well, if there's something you don't understand, ask. If the team in front of you is using a lot of edu-babble, and again, I know the educators on the Zoom call this morning will understand this. There's a lot of edu-babble flying around the room. Stop the meeting and get them to explain what these acronyms mean. If you don't receive the clarity that you need, keep asking until you do. Bring that notebook with you. Bring a friend. Because again, sometimes at these meetings, there's a lot of emotions that's traveling around and you may not catch everything. So if you can have someone come with you, a family member, or perhaps an agency member, there's many agencies that will send people along with you to support you. You take notes and have them ask questions, or they take notes and you ask the questions. And then later you can take those notes home and review them. This is your right and your responsibility. And the responsibility, of the school to ensure that they provide you the access and knowledge that you need to leave informed and able to make the decisions for your child that sit right with you. And just having an interpreter for those for whom English isn't your first language, that's just the beginning of providing supports for you. Point number 3, educate yourself, and I'll add to that, and speak up. Similar to my previous point, take those notes, ask those questions. Sometimes, again, I know you can sit at some of these tables because I've been there and there's all these educators, and oftentimes they don't look like us. And so you may feel intimidated, you may feel powerless, you may feel that you don't have the place or the right to speak up. You absolutely do, because you are part of that team in helping support the progress of your child. It's our responsibility as a parent to understand and and our right to get the supports from the school or the disability agencies to help us understand. It's also our right and our responsibility to advocate for our child. And I know that we do. And I want to make sure that we understand that there's a broad area that we need to advocate for our children. And it's not even just being reactive, but I hope what I'm putting across to the audience this morning is about being more proactive and hopefully lessening the possible conflicts that can come down the line later. So for example, I talked about field trips earlier. When you're on a field trip, the teachers may advise, there's no access to a microwave or anything like that. So your child needs to bring a sandwich. Well, I know that in the Black culture, at least in my family, my kids don't do sandwiches. That just doesn't agree with them. My son who's on the spectrum, he was used to his warm meals in his thermos. And so this is something you got to advocate for, and you got to work it out with the teacher that this is what's going to meet your child's needs. So again, remember to speak up and remember that cultural lens. Number 4, structure in the home. Extracurricular activities, regular homework schedule, meal times, and bedtime routines. Hopefully, as things now are starting to open up with the pandemic, there'll be a lot more extracurricular activities available to families. And there's a lot out there that's free or reasonably priced. Look at those options. It helps build our children's social skills. It helps contribute to the structure at home. And hopefully it'll provide some respite for you. And maybe the little one will get tired enough that the whole bedtime routine won't be as stressful as it could be. But it is important to keep these routines in place as consistently as possible. And again, as a parent, I've been there and I'm still there, even though he's a young adult. It is so very important so we can really set our kids up for success the next day. And finally, and probably even most important out of all of these things, self-care. And this can mean different things to different people from different backgrounds. For some of us, it's exercising and eating right. For some of us, it's getting it out. It's venting, it's getting out with a good friend. Sometimes I've had parents come and they're venting, they're getting it out with me. I let them do that. They need to do that. Then when it's all said and done, we can sit down and now we can have a conversation where we can meet in the middle and make decisions that's in the best interest of our children. And for some of us, it's nurturing our spirituality. And which is now so much more of a possibility. Now that churches and mosques and other places of worship are beginning to open up physically, now we can start to attend. But many of us are still attending our services online. That's also a very important part of the African diaspora culture. So, and this is something we need to talk about. This also contributes to our self-care, our mental health. Please don't remember these points. Again, as I'm closing off, it takes a whole village to raise a child. And school is a part of that village. The agencies that we partner with are a part of that village. Between home and school, and if I could find a picture to add in the agencies for the agencies that we're connected with us all working together, we're going to be better together for our special children. This is just a flyer. And again, this information has been shared in the chat with regards to our support group, again, that meets twice a month virtually. So if there's any Black caregivers in the audience, and for the educators on the line, please share with any Black families that you work with. And this isn't just for families with a child with autism. We have families with children and adults, I should add, with Down syndrome, with seizure disorders, with intellectual disabilities, and so on. So again, in general, if you have a child or a loved one with a disability and you want a group to connect with from that cultural lens, please send us an email and we'll get you connected and hooked up. Any further questions, our email has been placed in the chat. You can also find us on Facebook. And again, I thank you so much for giving up a portion of your Saturday to join us this morning. And we do hope that between Cassie's and my presentation, you've been able to take home some nuggets and digest it and really get some inspiration and some strength and some ideas for our educators on the line this morning to take back so we can be a better team to create more positive outcomes for our special children. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Sherron. That was a wonderful presentation. Oh, that was wonderful. So now I'm going to ask both of you to unmute and join us because it's time to answer some questions. We got some lovely questions going. Lots of people, I think, had lots of discussion ideas from your presentations. The first one, the first two, I guess, that we received, I'd like to see both of your perspectives because I think from, someone working a lot with educators and someone also working more, within the school and within the classroom, I think it'd be really interesting to have both perspectives. But someone asks, do you have any specific tips for helping support students with autism spectrum disorder or other sensory exceptionalities in following the new COVID guidelines in class, like wearing masks or staying apart? I don't know, wait, Sherron, do you want to begin?
Yeah, sure. I can start, Cassie. How I address it is patience. We have to start with patience. It's a lot, as was alluded to by Cassie earlier. Many of our children perhaps have been home learning virtually. A lot of things have been shut down. And so there's a lot of relearning that all of us have to do now being back in the school system. And so the school that I'm currently at, we do have several children on the spectrum throughout the range of grades. I'm at an elementary school, just to make that clear, a K-6 school. So for instance, with the mask wearing, I start with the shield. So perhaps you can speak to the teacher or the principal or vice principal about providing your child a shield. And then eventually with the mask, we start in intervals. So perhaps a child wears that mask for 10, 15 minutes, and then they can take a break and perhaps get a reward. And then we can move on from there. And so gradually, from moment to moment, hour by hour, day by day, we're going to get there. But at least if they have the shield in place, that is something, and that's something we can reward the child for. The same when it goes for the physical distancing, that can be a challenge because some children, they don't understand about that the space, the personal space bubble. So again, it's going to be a lot of visuals, a lot of teaching, a lot of patience. And again, that partnership between home and school. So that conversation, the social stories, when those social stories are created, make sure they go home. Families at home, make sure you're reviewing that with the child before they go to bed, when they wake up the next morning, and then when the child gets to school, again, it's being reviewed. But I think one of the biggest pieces is we got to give the child some time to adjust. So that would be a little bit what I would add. Cassie, send it to you.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, I think we've said all those things as well, Sherron, so thank you so much. When it comes to that physical distancing, keeping that language of what you really mean when you say stay apart, right? So if it's stay apart, try to keep it consistently saying that, and do a lot of practice outside of the times that you need the student to stay apart. So you can practice, show me stay apart from, put a chair down, show me stay apart from the chair, have a student move to the side, left or right, show me getting close to the chair, right? So that you understand that they understand your direction. That's key. And then like Sherron said, reward and that reinforcement I talked about at length in my presentation, because that really will solidify this is correct for that student. This is what we mean by stay apart, and doing the opposite is also really important. And just like Sherron said, when it comes to that desensitization, really when it comes to that mask, student with that sensitivity doesn't like the feeling of the mask, you would really want to go slow. So we've done it with, even before pandemic, some students don't like to wear their mittens, right? So you'd have to slowly get them accustomed to it and providing lots of rewards for them tolerating even just 1 second at a time. You might need to start there. So yeah, that's it.
Oh, that sounds good. And so the next question, I think I'm actually going to throw it to you first, Cassie, because I think it's really, asking about things that the teachers can do, but it's asking about tips on creating an inclusive environment in your school or classroom. Sometimes other kids can be mean when they see a difference. And this person is working with grades 7 and 8.
Mhm. So great question. That's why I did want to highlight that Autism Awareness and Acceptance Day. So if you can include those things into the student's sort of daily routine to even just talk about what are the signs and symptoms of autism, what are the challenges, and then very similar to rewarding a student with autism, if you notice that there's a sort of a great peer model in your classroom of 7 and 8, let that student know, highlight that student. I appreciate the way that you work alongside the student in our classroom who has autism, right? So it's just showing that difference. And if you did want potentially to have an Autism Awareness Day or something custom built, if you don't know where to start, you can contact us at sonderly.io and give us some time. We can build something for you to display in your classroom. But once again, I know it's tough, but that autism awareness and acceptance building is going to be really important for inclusivity.
Oh, sorry. Can I jump in this one? Excellent. Okay. Yeah, great stuff. And I love the suggestion to work with an agency like the Geneva Centre and Sonderly, to have perhaps someone come in and, well, I guess these days with the pandemic, perhaps would end up having to be a virtual assembly. But to add to that, it's really about, I think it would go beyond your classroom. So I think, again, the educators on the line, I don't know if there are any administrators on the line, or these are teachers or educational assistants and so on. But I think it goes back to the tone in your school as a whole, because when we're talking bullying, we have, or those feeling othered. Yes, there's those with disabilities. And then there's the issue of race. And then there's the issue of the LGBTQS plus community and so on, Islamophobia and so on. So what I'm hearing is about school tone on a whole, and discussing on a whole how we treat those who are different from us, who live different, who look different, who have different experiences and so on. So that's perhaps something to take back to your school and talk about your school, talk to your school team on a whole, is what can we do on a whole to change the vibe in our school. And if we're talking about inclusion, if we're talking about acceptance, if we're talking about equity and equality, then it's seen in our actions. And what are we doing, and what are we not doing? And now what do we start doing in order to set the tone? I think those who may be othering these children who are on the spectrum, if they get that sense on a whole, that this is a whole school understanding, this is a whole school philosophy, hopefully that will trickle down through all of your students in this school. So I hope that helps from the education perspective.
Yeah, I agree. Having like a general atmosphere of acceptance and of inclusivity is so important. And so that also really goes well into our next question, because it seems it's also asking about how to improve the general atmosphere and the general vibe within the parent-teacher relations. But it's asking, what are some ways to make it easier or less intimidating for caregivers to connect with me as the teacher? I don't know. I know, Sherron, you talked about lots of ways, for the parents using outside groups and stuff to, having extra support from other advocacy groups. I don't know if you want to go into more of that, or if Cassie, if you have specific tips from the teacher's side, ways that they can increase awareness of these groups or make it easier to connect.
Sherron, do you want to start with that one as an educator?
Sure, no worries. So sorry, just Emma, just so I can hear the question again. So this is how the teacher can reach out to the family? You could just repeat that for me, Emma?
Well, they're asking how to make it easier or less intimidating for caregivers to connect with me. And then they indicate that they are the teacher. So I guess I think they would also appreciate ways for them to make that connection as well, but also just to make it easier and less intimidating.
I think reach out. I think it's, I think sometimes what happens is the only time parents, he actually had a situation this week that the only time parents, or oftentimes when parents hear from their teacher, is negative. It's a complaint. It's about what the child has done wrong. And that's when the parent will kind of cut themselves off. And I've been there, cut themselves, because it's too much. They already know that their child brings an additional challenge to the school, to the class, to the situation. And they may be doing their best with what they have, with the skills that they have. So they want to know that you, teacher, are in the battle with them, that you believe in them as a parent, that you believe in the child as a student, regardless of what other features they may bring with them, their culture, their faith, their on the spectrum, if they're low function or high function. I'm not a fan of those terms, but I think you understand what I mean and all that entails. So I think teacher, reach out in between. Like there's a sunshine calls that I know a lot of the educators are making over the next few days, but also reach out in between and set up a meeting. So you don't have to wait till parent teacher interview to have a formal meeting. We know this. Sit down and have a meeting with them and say, hey, help me get to know your child a little bit more. And perhaps when that parent feels more comfortable with you, they'll just share more from your life, maybe even stuff that you didn't necessarily want to know. But when you do hear that, now it's like, okay, now I understand what this family is going through. And now I understand what this child is bringing to school. And so let me see what I can do to support them. Basically, what I'm saying is show them compassion, show them real, authentic care. And I think that will bring down those walls of intimidation.
Yeah, so when I worked as an instructor therapist, I really did collaborate a lot with families, right? And I would avoid jargon. I think you mentioned that earlier, Sherron. I think it's really important to, speak to them in a parent-friendly way. So that was one of my strategies to be able to connect with them, and then empower that parent to understand that they can do exactly what I do. And I would be glad to help assist and train. So creating that welcoming environment to say, come on in, like I'll show you what I'm doing today, and you don't have to get it right this time, but we'll work together.
Yeah, I fully agree.
So speaking of jargon, we had a quick question just in asking, what is a sunshine call? And that's something that I also don't know. So I think you.
Okay. So really, with a sunshine call, it's a term. It's call and say, hey, here I am. I'm Sherron Grant. I'm Mrs. Grant. I'm going to be your child's teacher this year. So happy to have them in the class. Is there anything I need to know that will help make your child feel more comfortable in my class? So because again, as I mentioned, oftentimes when the family hears from the school, it's not positive. So we want to start off the year with those positive sunshine calls. So thank you for asking. I appreciate that. I apologize for that wasn't clear.
Yeah, that is a good practice. As I say, also, we have someone who's asking, what does autism mean? And I know that that's such a big general question. I don't know if you want to go into detail there, but I was going to say, I know that Sonderly and the Geneva Centre have a lot of resources, about these kind of questions. So I didn't know if you wanted to share anything about that, about
like what I can share. Autism is a neurological and developmental disorder. So there will be differences with that individual. It's with regards to social communication or potentially repetitive interests. And it begins in childhood, and it does persist across the lifespan. So that's really broadly what autism means when we say autism. One would be diagnosed through the DSM-5, and that's how they would receive a diagnosis if some of those markers were present. So once again, neurological and developmental disorder.
And if I could add, it's a spectrum, and we have to remember that. So again, there's a saying, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So in working with children, with adults on the spectrum, don't assume that whatever works with this individual is going to work with that individual. Just like any other student, you got to get to know them all individually. Some on the spectrum may come with other comorbid or other kinds of challenges. Some may have intellectual disabilities, Some may not. Some may be on the gifted end of the cognitive development. Some may have Down syndrome or other kinds of challenges. So what I'm saying is get to know each child individually, who they are, what their assets are, what their deficits are, and then from there, you and your team plan how to support that individual best.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. I think that's a good place to stop it for today. I don't see any more open questions. Just people saying thank you for the presentation, which I would like to echo. I feel like I've also learned so much. But also to everybody else, unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. But don't worry, because we have these programs every month. You can subscribe to our newsletter to get details of all the events. And you can also check out the Ontario Science Centre website for more information about Sensory Friendly Saturdays and to see all of our past recorded sessions. A survey will appear when you leave this webinar, and it's from us, it's not a random one. But we would greatly appreciate your feedback. If you miss the survey, it will also be in the email, the follow-up email that we send with all the links that we've put in the chat. Our next session will be on October 2nd, and we hope to see you there. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
All right.